Hi, this is Mike Cook, and welcome to Positive Connections Radio. This show is intended to help break the stigma of mental health issues among first responders. I know from personal experience how PTSD, depression, and addiction can take over your life while suffering in silence. I was a police officer for 19 years and spent the last 10 years of my career as an undercover narcotics detective. I didn't reach out because of fear, lack of trust, shame, and stigma. It took me losing it all before I got help. With a new perspective and passion for life, I can now help others find a way out. Working together with peer support, wellness units, and the mental health and recovery field, we can bring about positive change for the ones who protect us all. The guests on this show offer unique and valuable information, support, and experience, and are the voice for those waiting to be heard. Enjoy the show. Welcome back, everybody, to Positive Connections Radio. This is Mike Cook, and I hope your day is going great. Either way, your day will be a lot better after listening to my next guest, Christian Heldman. Christian, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Michael. How's it going with you?
Great. It's so awesome to have you on the show, and we met a few years ago through a Rock to Recovery, and I'm telling you what, I am so excited that you're here with me. So tell me a little bit about yourself and what got you to this point.
Yeah, so what got me to the Rock to Recovery point was music and recovery. And how that played out for me was, I'm in recovery. I was a heroin addict. It took my life down really hard and not so fast, more of a slow ride down. I'm fortunate to be alive and speaking with you today.
And we are too, for sure.
Yeah. I ended up, I grew up around music. My father was a known jazz musician. He played bass, upright bass, and he played piano. And so from an early childhood, I was surrounded by music. He was constantly bringing people over. He had a jazz coffee house in Seattle, and he was bringing people over to his coffee house. And as a baby, I was around live jazz music.
Wow. So you grew up from the very beginning, huh?
Yeah. It was, it's funny because today sometimes when I play with people, they're like, so I'm not a jazz musician. I'm a rock musician. And
right. I'll
play some guitar and people will say, well, that has a real jazzy feel to it. However, I don't know how to I'm not a jazz, I can't do a bunch of jazz comp chords. Just never explored improvised jazz. But apparently I exude a little jazz feel because I've heard that several times when I'm playing, and it must be something to do with growing up with it.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. And, it's in your blood, and also you were raised with it since you were a baby.
Right. My dad suffered with addiction / mental health issues. When he had his nightclub, there was a well-known jazz trumpet player that was a pharmacist. Mm. And my father had befriended his son, who ended up becoming a famous trumpet player. His name's Jay Thomas.
Right.
And my dad's job, the father asked my father, help keep my son off the hard stuff. And in return, I'll give you all of the amphetamine that you want.
Wow. Good.
That was the trade. You keep my son off the smack and I'll give you all the twack you want.
Right on. Okay. That makes sense to me for being an addict myself. So.
Yeah. And my father was also, my father was also a police officer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it was interesting because at the time he was asked to, he had a great military record, like Airman of the Year, and he was great with hand-to-hand combat and marksmanship and test scores. So he ranked really high in the Air Force. And when he got out, the Seattle Police Department asked him to walk the beat. He actually turned it down because At the time, it was like early 60s, 61. And it was before the whole like hippie kind of like, conscious movement started. And there was a lot of racial tension on the streets.
Yeah.
It was, the civil rights, Kennedy, all that was going on. And it wasn't, it was just really tense on the street. And he saw a lot of stuff that he wasn't willing to participate in. So he worked in the evidence room, and what ended up happening was he would see a lot of stuff. He would see he'd see a lot of guys coming in with like half the load they were supposed to have, and
I got it.
All that kind of stuff. And so, but he didn't want to walk the beat and be a part of the like segregation and abuse that was going on the street. And he also, in the military, had started playing jazz music and he was roomed with mainly African American guys. So he was comfortable playing music with black guys, basically. And what happened was, when he got out of the Air Force, he opened up this jazz coffee house. And at the time, local law enforcement was not keen on his club because his club was bringing in names like McCoy Tyner, Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock. Yeah, and a lot of those names were associated with heroin, because a lot of those old jazz players were heroin addicts, whether they be white or black.
Yeah.
And so the police were not very hip on his club, so they actually gave him a choice. They said, you can keep your job with us or you can keep your nightclub, but you can't do both. And he was getting harassed. He would literally get harassed walking down in the University District in Seattle by the police.
His own people, right?
What's that?
His own people. He was working with them too.
Yeah, he got harassed by his own people for having a club that was not, it was pushing the boundaries for the time.
Talking about stigma, thick stigma back then, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And then he got into, he started playing, he started really putting a lot of time into the music, and he was a drummer for a band. And then he was, he started out on drums in a band called the Playboys, and they were rock and roll. However, his love was jazz. He ended up partnering up with this guy named David Friesen, and David Friesen is like a world-renowned jazz bass player, and they were a piano player, bass player combo. And then he took over this club from this guy, well-known jazz guitar player. Anyway, he took over this club for him, and that's about the time I was born. I spent a lot of time around it, and then so. What happened, though, what I mentioned earlier, my father was he was using amphetamines, and his reasoning was that he was working his day job, and then he would go straight into his nightclub and play music until late hours of the night.
Right.
So it was like,
and that was way before methamphetamine came about.
Yeah.
That was just the regular amphetamines.
Yeah, and it was pharmaceutical grade. It was way before. It was before the Beatles. It was before before it was hip to do drugs.
Sure.
Like before it was a subculture that was cool.
Right.
What happened though was the amphetamine, as I've seen, and I know you've seen, it takes a hold of people, and it jars the brain and can cause psychotic reactions and paranoid delusions. What happened was it got too much for him. Everything got too much for him. And his friend, David Friesen, who's his bass player friend, moved down to Portland, Oregon. And he was talking with my dad, and he said, hey, you ought to come down to Portland. They got a really good jazz scene down here. So my dad moved myself, my older sister, and my mom down to this small town just on the other side of the Oregon border. And he continued to play music in Portland. So what that looked like for me was I grew up in a home that dad wasn't around much. And then to make a living, he took on odd jobs, which is the conundrum for a lot of artists.
Right.
If you're a pop artist or you're a rock star, it's like 1 in a million gets the shot to actually make a good living at it.
Sure. And you're doing something you love to do, but you can't make a bunch of money on it because you haven't got the stardom yet or the public behind you yet on it.
Right. And with jazz guys, even the ones that had big names, a lot of them were barely able to pay their bills or buy a house.
Right.
It's not a stable income. So in this town we grew up in, we were, one of the poorest families in the town for sure. My dad would take little jobs working at the time, the pay rate was like $2 or $3 an hour for manual labor. I mean, obviously money was worth a bit more back then. The dollar was.
Sure.
So what happened was I grew up wearing hand-me-down clothes and lacking for some of the basic needs. I don't know if that's what brought about my addictive nature or I could have used a drink at like 5 years old.
Wow, really?
Yeah, that's what I felt like. And then, and my father had some twisted. He had become a Christian, so he had like twisted beliefs. He could, when you mix methamphetamine with like any kind of like spiritual text, it can be dangerous.
Exactly. It could be psychotic eventually.
Yeah, psychotic, delusional, grandiose, all of that. So there was that element. Now, when I was, according to my father, he only used one time after I was born, but there was lingering effects. There was effects from, lack of sleep and too much wild lifestyle. So just because he stopped using the substance, that didn't mean everything was okay with him. Like he held on to some of the irrational, illogical belief systems that he had. And he would act out his character. He would get angry easy sometimes and blow up in these rages. And those are all common characteristics of somebody that's not taking care of themselves and has some mental health issues.
Right.
So I grew up with that, was bullied a lot, was picked on a lot. I think, kids are cruel. And when you're singled out as the poor family in town, it's going to happen. So I have a real soft spot when I see the underdog or somebody that I work with teenagers in my line of work today, not just teenagers, but I have worked with a lot of teens, and I've seen some teens that I can tell by talking to them and having them share with me and vice versa. I can tell that they're in a similar situation as what I was in when I was a young kid. So my heart goes out to the underdog for sure. So, at like 8 years old, I started smoking weed with the neighbor family, grew pot, and their kids would sneak in and steal pot. And like I said before, I was looking for a way to change the way I felt from a very young age.
And at that age, you don't understand what's going on anyway. You're in this element that you're growing up and you don't have what other kids have, and you're being bullied and picked on, and you're looking for an escape.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was looking for an escape from reality. And, my dad had this whole thing about, he was reading Revelations in the Bible, which if you've ever checked that out, it's kind of like, it's almost like the chapter itself is kind of like a bad acid trip.
It's doomsday for sure.
It's doomsday. And so, I don't think that a child is meant to be indoctrinated with doomsday stuff. So I remember vividly at like 7, 8 years old, like looking out my window in the rainy Washington state and looking out and just waiting for the end of the world to come at like 7 and 8 years old. Yeah, that incurs some darkness upon a young child's mind. So, as soon as somebody introduced something to me that would change the way that my reality was, I was all on board with it and smoked a little grass with the neighbors starting about 8 or 9 years old. And then at 11 years old, I went up and visited with my cousin, and his parents were big drinkers, so we would pour a bunch of different kind of booze out of his father's liquor cabinet and mix it into a glass. And I remember the first time I got drunk, and it was blissful, and I acted the fool, and I had a great time doing it.
Right.
And that was at 11. And after I did that, I remember having that thought. I've heard this a lot when I've listened to people share their stories in the recovery field, and they say, I remember that first drink and I just felt great, and then I puked, and it wasn't, I felt sick, and then the next day I woke up and I wanted to do it all again.
Yep.
And that's exactly what happened. I woke up and I was like, I can't wait to do that again. That was that very present thought. That was, 11, 12 years old. When I was 13, my father and I had a falling out. I was that rebellious teenager. And it was funny. It was kind of like out of that movie. Well, it was basically a rebellious act towards my dad. I went to a high school dance. I didn't tell him. I came home. Things got physical, and I left. And I remember I ran away for a few days and had a little adventure. And then I came back to this small town where my dad was, and I had met this guy and his wife owned the restaurant up the street, and they had two little girls that were like 2 or 3 years old. And my solution was to move in with this guy. Now, the reason I liked this guy at 13 years old is because he was like a big kid. He smoked weed. He rode motorcycles. And so I left my home and I moved in with this young couple. What I didn't know is that this guy suffered from some severe PTSD. He'd lost 2 brothers in Vietnam. He was in Vietnam himself.
Wow.
And he was abusive, and he was a pretty hardcore criminal. So living with him, I, committed my first crimes, breaking in and entering and people's houses I shouldn't have been in, and stealing stuff, and drugs, and
right.
Using drugs, cocaine, pills. And this is, all at 13. So my cousin from Seattle drove down to visit our family, and he hung out with me for a day. And during that day, he saw enough to where he called his mother, who was my dad's sister in Seattle. And he told her, he's like, if we don't get Christian out of this town, he's going to die. It was, for my age, it was stuff that, older 20-year-old kids are on that criminal path are doing.
And at that point too, you've already been raised with, some kind of mental illness with your dad, and now you're living with this guy and his wife and his small kids, and he has some PTSD issues from the war, and you're stuck in addiction. Yeah,
and he's a full-blown addict. He was abusive a few times to me. One time I remember I was watching these other kids out playing in the snow, and I ran off for like 20 minutes to go join them and have fun. And I came back, and he slammed my head down into a table, and my teeth went through my lip. And it was just and then I was scared. Then I was I felt trapped and he was sick. And so I felt really trapped. My cousin was like a godsend. He came down right after that. And my cousin brought me, he packed up a bag and put me in his car and drove me up to Seattle with him. And I was born in Seattle. So I had family up there. And when I got to Seattle, they weren't sure what to do with me. I had an older cousin that I'm close with today, and he wanted me to move in with him. Now he was 18, and his parents weren't around much, so they basically bought him and his older brother a house. And he was like, yeah, Christian can come stay with us. Right. And my aunt was like, no, he's not going to, because they were partiers. And, here I am 13 years old, and my cousin's saying, yeah, you can just move in with us.
Sure.
And my aunt was like, no, he's going to move in with us. And so I moved in with my aunt, and right there, everything changed. And, I remember I met Kurt Cobain, and later on, I found out details about his life that I really resonated with. And it was this. It was like he grew up in a small town, not far from my small town. His father was a struggling, he was a gas station attendant. So he grew up in poverty, and he was exposed to religion at a young age. And then one day he releases an album, and he becomes the most famous person in the world.
Exactly. And this was young when you met him, right? Weren't you in your teenage years?
No, I met him later on in my
okay.
But when I read his story, I related a lot to it, because his dysfunction as a young child and a teenager, and then his, being rocketed into another level of, a whole nother level of, the fame. And how I related to it was a much smaller level as far as like the fame part. But when I got to this high school in Seattle, living with my aunt, it was like all of a sudden I'm living in this big, nice house. I'm immediately taken out and bought all these fancy clothes. And I go to this school, and like the rep for the whole school, who ended up being like a well-known politician in Seattle, his job was to like walk the new guys around and introduce them to the different like cliques and like see where, kind of help him fit in.
Right.
So he walked me around, and it was so funny at this high school, because like I'd been there a couple weeks, and some girl and I were communicating, and she called me at my aunt's house, and she started telling me, she goes, I really like you, and I can't believe all the cool stuff you've done. And what I found out about this high school is they basically made up a reputation for me. So
before you got there, or during when you first got there?
When I first got there, and she goes, "That's so cool. You like study karate, and you're from California."
Wow.
And the funny thing is, the closest I ever got to karate, I mean, I like the idea that I used to stand in front of my mirror and practice kicking.
Right,
but
right.
I didn't do karate class, and I'd never been to California. So they had this like ready-made reputation for me. And the irony of it is I immediately got in with this clique of guys, and they were like kind of do-gooder jock guys. And these guys had like, they went on to become, doctors and lawyers. And what happened was, 2 weeks before I came to this high school, there was this guy driving this Volkswagen van with 4 guys in it, and the van crashed, and one of the guys flew out the window and died, and his name was Christian. And wow. I ended up coming into that same group of guys with the same name, and basically becoming
the Christian that they
his
lost.
Role.
Wow.
Life is weird like that.
That is weird.
I at that time I'd been playing, I basically was playing a lot of drums as a child. And my dad bought me a kit when I was about 5. And by the time I was, 11 years old, I was a fairly decent rock drummer. And then I ended up continuing with the drums in high school band in Seattle. But I'd also switched to guitar when I was about 13, 14. I switched to guitar and started playing that as well. And so the first thing that was big at my high school was Alice in Chains started there. Right. I was in drum class with their original drummer that actually formed the band, and their bass player. So obviously at the time I didn't know that they were going to become a worldwide sensation in like a couple years.
You have no idea at that time, because you're just like doing your life.
Yes. And what I noticed was that, okay, when I got to my aunt's house, I laid off all the stuff except for, I wouldn't say occasional, but there was no more drugs.
Right.
As far as partying was concerned, I was like, now I was hanging out with the jocks and the preps. So I was like, we would drink, and alcohol it didn't really grab me as, being that fun. It was more like a social experiment to like, fit in with the guys and have a good time with the fellas. And, right. But for the first several months that I was there aunt's house. I didn't use any substances or drink. And what I did know, though, is that I slipped into a severe depression at 14. Like nothing, like I would, every morning before school, I'd be like sitting in a chair and I'd like be curled over with my arms folded around my stomach and I'd be rocking. And my aunt was like, "What is going on with you?" I'd be like, "I'm fine." I would just play the "I'm fine" card. And I really didn't know what was going on with me. And then what I came to realize later is that, I was somebody that didn't want to deal with reality. And it's kind of like I was a little bit damaged goods already. You can take me out of this home that's filled with dysfunction and poverty and abuse and all this, and you can put nice clothes on me and put me into this beautiful home and introduce me to all these successful children or kids that are popular in school, but I'm still going to be the same guy that I was a year before.
You just take it with you. You took it with you where you were, and you shoved it down and never really resolved anything.
Right. So what happened with that was I started gravitating, after being there in that high school for about a year, I started gravitating towards towards kind of like, I don't know if you remember the movie The Outsiders.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Remember you had like the preps and the jocks. Yeah. And so you have the guys from the rich side of the tracks, and then you got the rebel dudes.
Right.
I started gravitating towards the rebel dudes, and actually it was almost like they reached out to me, and they looked like they were having a lot more fun. So I started hanging out with those guys, and while that was happening, I started getting in a little bit of trouble here and there. Right before high school graduation, the wheels fell off for me. And it was, the irony of it was, socially I fit in pretty good. Like I had 3 different girls ask me to prom, but I never made it to prom, and I didn't graduate. I remember I went out one night with this friend of mine, and he introduced me to this older guy that had some mushrooms, and he gave me some of the mushrooms that he picked out of his backyard, and I took them home to my aunt's house, and she wasn't there, and I cooked up a batch of these mushrooms. Right. And I remember I had remember the band Boston?
Yeah. Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah. So in the 70s, they had all those hits, and then so I latched on to them, and I really liked their stuff. And then in the 80s, they took a hiatus for like 10 years. And then in the 80s, they announced this comeback album. I bought the album, and when I opened it up, it had this one song on it, and it said, if you play this at a certain decibel, not super loud,
right,
it'll actually vibrate things in your house. And so, I drank this cup of mushroom tea that I'd cooked up, and I put that album on, and sure enough, the photographs on the mantle started skipping across the mantle. Thought that was pretty amazing, but what ended up happening was my aunt came home, and she goes, "What's that sweet smell?" And like the whole house was permeated with like this sweet smell. Mushroom tea. And when she came home, she walked downstairs, and I was downstairs sitting in this chair with all the lights out, and she just looked at me, and she just looks at me and shakes her head. I just had that feeling that was just the last straw. It was too much for her to see that. And I was, super pale and just out of it. And she pulled me aside, and she's like, you can't be here. Like, you got to go. It's time. And this was all on the heels of me also failing out in high school and certain other, just not doing well. So I left her place, and I moved in with one of my high school friends that was drinking heavily, later on got sober, and would have nothing to do with me. Right. But I ended up moving in with him, and then from that point, my music history kicked in. My skills and my ability to play kicked in, and the Seattle scene was just blooming with it. It completely supported my anger, my lifestyle, and the debauchery that I was ready to get into. And immediately, one of my friends' girlfriends was dating Pearl Jam's guitar player. And I started hanging out in that scene. I started playing with a lot of different musicians in the scene. And that went really well. Musically, it was a lot of fun. Like, I wouldn't trade those times for anything. It was a good experience. But I was very lost. I was using multiple substances. One night it might be cocaine and alcohol. Another night it might be methamphetamine, and that might last for 2 or 3 days.
Right.
And so what happened in that 90s decade for me was I got to rub elbows and play in rooms with members of, Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, Alice in Chains.
Most people can't say that they've done that before and actually survived.
Right. Most of those guys most of the frontmen that were singing all that kind of depressed, problem with heroin, problems with relationships. A lot of the songs were about the darker side of things. Most of those guys are no longer living. Yeah. And that's a part of my story. I work for Rock to Recovery now, where we do, music sessions, and we go around all these different treatment centers, and we work with veterans, and we have a contract with the Wounded Warriors, and we work with troubled teenagers. And a lot of times I'll share a little bit about the story, and I'll talk about some of the elbows that I've rubbed,
right,
and people I've played with. And the main clincher point that I put on the end of that story is that most of the guys that I hung out with, played music with, that you will hear on the radio still to this day on a heavy rotation, are no longer living.
That is so powerful. And I bet your reaction from the people you're dealing with in the recovery centers, is probably pretty stunning, because I know Rock to Recovery, and it started a little bit ago, and I've dealt with you through them, and it's an amazing program. And to get that word out to say, hey, popularity, fame, stardom is great, and you think using drugs and everything is going to make it better, but look where it is now. It's just a memory. It's a recorded memory right now, and people can go back to it, but the people that actually started it are no longer with us.
Right. And especially with like Kurt Cobain. So, with Kurt Cobain, I'll go into a facility and you got 12-year-old kids wearing a Nirvana shirt.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And they're like, and a lot of them, even to this day, it surprises me. You got 12 years old up to like, guys my age, and Kurt Cobain is their hero. And one of the main questions they ask me a lot is, when they know that I met him, they're like, well, do you think Courtney killed him? And I go, no, I think depression and drug addiction killed him.
Yes.
Like, you can spin, people like to spin conspiracy theories. However,
look at Jim Morrison. There's still people wearing Doors shirts, and he's an icon, and he's been away from us since like 1970, right? Yeah, and the most practical thing, when I was a huge Doors fan. I'm with you.
Love Jim Morrison, his way of singing. He was my hero because he was so wild and just so carefree. And what I think when I watch the documentaries and I hear the timeline from people that were around him at the time that he died, his girlfriend, on and off girlfriend for years, was a heroin addict.
Yep.
And he was not hip on the whole heroin scene. However, when they found him in that bathtub, drowned, overdosed in that bathtub, she was using heroin at that time. And I was thinking to myself, this guy's running from the law. He's not allowed to play in the United States anymore. He's got warrants out for his arrest. What would stop that guy in that Paris hotel room from doing some of his girlfriend's heroin?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I tell the kids, I'm like, no, I don't think Courtney killed him. I think he was super depressed, and he had just bounced out of a rehab in Los Angeles and hopped back on a plane and went back home and copped a bunch of heroin and cocaine and went and bought a firearm and blew his head off because he was so miserable because he felt the powerlessness of not being able to get off the drugs.
Exactly. And who to reach to especially when you reach that point of fame, who are you going to talk to? And when everybody else is doing it around you and actually encouraging you. Look at Elvis Presley. I mean, everybody encouraged him until the day he died. They never stood up and said, hey, you have an issue bigger than you think it is. Maybe you need to, get some help.
It's got to be hard. I know guys that are, not famous. However, they have a lot of income, like they're wealthy, their families are wealthy, and they're the guys that I see have the hardest time getting and staying clean because the consequences aren't there.
Right.
If I had millions of dollars in my bank account and a full-blown heroin addiction, it would be really hard for me to make that choice.
There's no loss. The only loss that they ever see is their own death. And they're not going to lose their houses. They're not going to lose their money. And they're not going to lose their friends, especially if they have a bunch of cash.
Right. And they can always buy their way into the next comfy detox or rehab.
Right.
And take all the right vitamins and, get massages when they're detoxing. And so it's funny. I've done a little work around that area because I actually had resentments towards some of my buddies that had it like that. And,
right.
And there's the other side of the coin is, I was able to reach a point of desperation where I was willing, and that point of desperation was definitely strengthened by knowing that if I didn't stop, that I was going to lose everything that I had. So my recovery journey ended up at about the age of 27. I was a late bloomer with the opiates, but I know that I'd been through all the different drugs. I'd done the LSD, the mushrooms, the cocaine, the crystal meth at about 27 years old. And I was at my prime. I was actually right in the middle of getting to play with a bunch of these guys that were rock stars. And right about that time, I was introduced to smoking heroin. And that was the perfect drug for me because all the answers that I was searching for and all the peace of mind that I didn't even know I was looking for, but was looking for in these drugs, I found in heroin because it just shut down all the noise. It was like laying on a cloud and having God massage your temples.
Wow. What a description.
Yeah.
That's great. Yes. I get it too for personal experience myself doing that drug. It set me to a different spot where everything was right. I can deal with my life as long as I have this drug in my system.
Yep. No concerns. And so time I was 27 years old. My friend had started working with the some retired Hells Angels in Canada where at the time Vancouver had a real lax policy on marijuana, and Washington State still had a really strict policy on marijuana. It's legal there now, but back in the day, you get caught with a gram of pot and you're going to jail.
Right.
So because of the difference in the laws, Vancouver people in Canada were growing a lot of marijuana, warehouses full of it, and they were bringing it down to Washington State. And a friend of mine started selling pot for these retired Hells Angels. And when I say retired, I mean, they're not riding around on motorcycles with ponytails. They're like business suits with short hair, and they're buying homes and big boy toys up in the mountains. So he was trying to do his little thing, and they met me. And what happened was I became, overnight became like the biggest distributor of marijuana, one of the biggest distributors in Seattle. And what that brought was immediate flux of mass amounts of cash. This is a kid that grew up with nothing. I didn't know how to manage, operate that kind of cash flow. I mean, there was weeks where I was making $50,000 and just rolled hundreds and fifties, and I didn't know what to do with it. And at the same time that happened, this kid was coming over to my house and he was bringing this black tar heroin. I started smoking it. So it was like the devil's timing, because at the same time I'm learning about this drug that takes all the pain away, I'm also making more money than I know what to do with.
And at the same time, also, you're living your life's passion of playing music, and you're with all these other people that are like being very successful in the business, and you're like teeter-tottering right in the middle there and going overboard with the heroin now.
Yeah. And I'm also becoming wealthy in a different way than with my music.
Sure.
So what ended up happening was I smoked that heroin for about 3 months straight. And then one day my guy didn't come over. The guy that used to come over every morning, and we'd sit and we'd smoke some of that heroin off some tinfoil, and he'd leave me a big chunk of it, and I'd give him some marijuana, and he'd leave, and it was a routine. And then after about 3 months of that, one day he just didn't come by. That day I didn't have any opiates, any heroin in my system, and things were, normal. And then I went to sleep that night, and I woke up the next morning and I was dripping with sweat. And I went over to the mirror and I looked in the mirror, and I had these huge pupils, and I'm pouring sweat, and I did not know what was happening because I'd never taken a break. And that was the first break. And I walked down to my buddy's restaurant down a couple blocks down the street. And he was a guy that I would smoke heroin with. I walked down to his restaurant, and I open his door, and he takes one look at me, and I'm like, dude, what's going on with me? And he's like, you're dope sick. And I remember as a child, some of my father's friends, jazz musicians, would tell me, don't ever mess with that heroin stuff. It's evil. I always remembered hearing people say that. But that day, I knew what they were talking about.
Right. And a lot of people listening right now, probably a lot of them never experienced that before. I have personally, but describe what that feeling is of not having that in your system after having it for 3 months every day in your system.
It's like all those worries and concerns that were drowned out, and all of the anxiety that we feel in normal life, that we use healthy things like yoga and meditation and therapy to counteract. They all come flooding back 1,000 times what they were before. And physically, you're nauseous, you're freezing 1 minute, then you're boiling hot the next minute. You're like liquid is coming out of your nose, and your diarrhea, and you're vomiting, and it's like having the flu.
Yeah.
The flu times 1,000. And I've talked to people in recovery, and they said that the closest they got to using in recovery is when they were really sick. It's a real big trigger for a lot of people to medicate when they're sick. So
it's so much pain. You feel like you're going to die, but you don't. You have to suffer through it.
Yeah, you got to suffer through it. And, I am 27 years old with a lot of money and no desire to suffer through anything like that. And so that started a many year run with the heroin. And what ended up after I'd been doing it for about a year, I remember my friend came over, and I don't know if you call them friend at that point. It's basically just codependent drug buddies at that point. Guy comes over and he says, you're wasting your money. You're spending $300 a day on this stuff. Why don't you try it this way? And I let him inject me in the arm. He said, if you do it this way, you're going to spend $50 a day instead of $300 a day. And
which is a lie, probably, right?
It's only, it's a lie, because that $50 a day is only for, a short while.
Limited time.
Yeah. Then the tolerance goes up. Then you're back to $300 a day, and now you're shooting heroin.
Right. I
remember when he did it for me, I was like, okay, this is a pretty good feeling here. This is intense. And I had a phobia of needles from a young child. They would have to strap me down in a dentist chair to stick a needle in my mouth. And
wow.
And I ended up getting over that phobia. And one thing that happened was there was a situation where one of the big distributors from Canada brought down some marijuana, and I went to go meet him. And due to his lackadaisical business skills and ability to stay hidden and sneaky as a drug dealer.
Right.
I got caught up with him. I had to get an attorney and I had to go to court. And I, basically was able to expunge my way out of trouble with some money.
Right.
However, I had a record and I was on the radar. So that put an end to the massive amounts of cash coming in. Right. And so for the next couple years, I burned through that cash, and my decision making, growing up undisciplined growing up without money, then being undisciplined and being a junkie on top of it. I had an apartment downtown. I had a house up in the north end. I had motorcycles. I had cars. And there was that part of me too that I was trying to buy people. I already had good friends, but when I started making all this money and started doing the heavy drugs, there was a part of me that felt like I had to buy people. So I was like, I'd be buying cars for friends and what I noticed is that people, when I start to try to buy people and their affection, that they actually respect me less. I wasn't trying to necessarily be a high roller type of guy. I was just, my big heart was just confused with, this is how you show love. So
material things and money and cars.
Yeah. But it took me a couple years to blow through all of that ill-gotten cash. That was the real start of my downward spiral, because when the money ran out, then I had, then the lifestyle that goes along with being an addict kicks in, being a heroin addict, and it's lying and cheating and stealing. And so I went from a guy that never had to worry about that to a guy that now was fully immersed in lying, cheating, and stealing, and hanging out with guys that supported their habits by doing those things.
And you're in survival mode. You have to have that drug in your system to either survive it. You don't know anything else.
Right. Like any good, I've heard this before in recovery meetings, like any good, tough junkie, when things got rough, I went back to mom and dad.
Right.
And they happened to live down near Portland still. And when I got to Portland, I wasn't able to stay clean. Now, at this point, I'd never heard of 12-step recovery. I had no idea that detox or rehab or any of that even existed. And by this time, I'm in my early 30s. I was running the streets of Portland using heroin, and some people I was hanging out with started telling me stuff like, "Oh, I'm going into detox." And I'd be like, "What's that?"
Right.
And then they said, "Oh, it's this place you go and you can get off the heroin, and they'll give you they'll give you some pills so that you're not so sick, and then they'll keep you there for like, a couple weeks, and it's a county funded program." And I followed them in. That was my first exposure to the recovery community. And what that looked like was, I'd be in this detox in this bath, like hospital gown, and doing a shuffle down the hallway because I was so underweight and weak and pilled up on some benzodiazepine pills. And then they'd say, "Okay, it's 7:00. We're having a H&I panel." I remember people coming in, like a panel of like 5 or 6 people. And I would see like these guys that looked like they had their life together. They seemed happy. And I felt like I was in a prison, and these people looked free. And
wow.
and the girls that would come in were like, smiling and attractive, and they'd tell their story. And I'd hear how somebody went from being like a street level shooting heroin under the bridge junkie to being like, at the end of their story, they'd say, "And I just married Johnny and we're buying a house together." Right. And I like, wow, okay. So, and they'd say, 5 years, I've got 5 years clean and sober. Or I'd see a guy come in that was like, he'd share a story about how he'd lost his family and his kids, and he was drinking himself to death. Now he's, he would just go off on all these things that he was doing now that were super positive, and his family was put back together, and he's now doing all these great things in the community, and it's because he hasn't drank in 7 years.
Right.
And I'd like to say that, the first time I heard these stories, I was like, "Oh, I'm joining this club. These people they got what's going on.
Right.
That's not the case. But it did introduce me to the recovery community. And, I started going, now that I knew this detox was there, I knew that there was a place that I could go get help. And the thing with the addict mind, with my addict mind, is when I left that detox, I thought I was perfect. I thought I was ready to go.
You're fixed, right?
Yeah, I had no desire to use. It's really easy to have no desire to use when there's a part of you that craves the freedom of the outside, like literally just being outside of a confines of a medical institution. And also, it's easy for a mind that's still clouded by Valium or Librium or some kind of pills that are keeping you calm. Sure. It's easy for that mind to say, I got this. Now, as soon as that mind of mine walked out and smelled the fresh air and those pills wore off, I was on a run again. And that happened over and over again. Now, I'll fast forward a bit on, I ended up going to that detox probably 10 different times over the next few years. Then my sister called me. She was in San Diego, and she said, come on down to San Diego because you're going to die up there. And they had a plan. It worked out with a family friend of ours that had a bunch of medical issues. He had boxes full of bottles full of methadone. So they brought me down to San Diego, and that started my weaning off heroin and getting on methadone process, which I was on taking those pills religiously for over a year. Then as a little over a year came up, my sister was like, just want you to know that, we're running out of these pills. So I started slowly weaning off the pills. And this is where I want to touch on the power of what like Subutex and Suboxone, which they're using these pills a lot. Of course. For detox. And I just want to share about the strength of these pills because I had run out of the methadone. As soon as the methadone was gone, even though at the end of my taper, I was only taking like a half a pill a day, which is 2.5 milligrams of methadone. Okay. I did that for a couple weeks. And then they gave me, then I had nothing. And the withdrawals started to kick in, and it wasn't extremely horrible, but I wasn't sleeping, and it was uncomfortable. About a week into this withdrawal, this girlfriend of my sister's was down from Seattle, and I told her kind of how I was open and honest, and I told her I was basically coming off of drugs, and she reached into her purse and she pulled out a Suboxone pill, and she wasn't even like, she's just, some people can just have random pills and they're not like, they don't even, so she pulls out this Suboxone pill and I take it, and 15 minutes later, I felt like, let's go to the bar.
It's amazing what these drugs do. Definitely the opiate blockers for sure.
I was high. I wasn't just like I was high. So from there, that just let me know the power of these opiate blocker pills. And I went from there. That was just one pill. And then I got off that stuff. And then I tried to become normal. And normal looks like I'm working a job, but I'm smoking a lot of pot, or I'm drinking a lot of alcohol. Right. And I thought I had reached that level of normalcy. And what ended up happening is I went into a work one day, and this guy we were talking about drugs, and he pulled out a meth pipe, and I smoked a little of the meth. And then he's like, oh, I got some pills. And he handed me some morphine pills. Now at the time I hadn't done any hard drugs in a year and a half, except, well, that's not true. I was weaning off the methadone, but I hadn't done any heroin or crystal for a long time. Right. And as soon as I took those pills, I was off and running again. I'd never done heroin in San Diego, but now it was the time to go look for it. And I went to the seediest neighborhood, and I found it, and I started using heroin. And that went on for months. And I got strung out again on the heroin. And a friend of mine, a musician friend, came down from Portland, and stayed with me. And while he was staying with me, he was an alcoholic. I had actually met him in Detox, and then we formed a band up in Portland. He was a great guy. He used to play with the Jesus and Mary Chain, which was a well-known touring band. And when he came down from San Diego, to San Diego, he ended up drinking. And when he drank, he was just like a blackout, the worst kind, the kind that would piss himself, alcoholic. But he moved out of my apartment, and I didn't hear from him for a while. And then one day he called me, and I was on like day 2 or day 3, no money, no heroin. I was dope sick. And he's like, hey man, I just want you to know that, I got like 6 months or whatever it was sober. And he called a buddy of his and had his buddy come pick me up and took me to a meeting. And I was in that meeting, and I had my head hunched over. I'm dripping snot on the floor. I'm freezing cold, dope sick. And at the end of the meeting, a group of guys came up and surrounded me. And they basically took me from that meeting and did not let me out of their grip for months. That's where my first time that I ever followed suggestion. And I went and I did the steps, went through the steps, the 12-step program with this guy.
Did you know these guys that took care of you? Did you know them at the time?
Nope. I had never met any of them. And they just could tell I was suffering, and they wanted to help.
Wow.
Yeah. And that showed me that people were willing to help me with no motive attached except to see me do better.
Exactly. That's what the program was about. So you started doing 12 steps?
Started doing the 12 steps. And I remember my sponsor was young. He was like 21 years old. And here I am in my, I'm 40 or whatever at this time. Right. And, but it wasn't about his age. It was about his willingness to like spend time with me and go over all this, the 12-step work, which dealt with a lot of my childhood traumas and, deep, heavy stuff and the spiritual part of it all. And what happened was, I put some time together. I put over 3 years together, and I had got everything, the semblance of a normal life all back together again. I had a good job, had a, nice home, car, beautiful significant other. And I put over 3 years together. And here's the thing I like to share. And when I do a check-in with a lot of my clients is that I went out after 3 years. And when I would walk into a meeting, when I came back in to the 12-step recovery groups, people would be like, well, what do you think took you out? And I was always trying to put a reason and figure it out. Like, well, did you not do your 4-step properly? Did you not do this properly? Did you not do this? And what I've come to learn is mainly the reason I went out is because I was ungrateful for what I had. That was it.
You didn't appreciate what you got. You just took it for granted and just let your program sort of fall by the wayside, probably.
Yeah, I was ungrateful for what I had, and I was not grateful for all the people in my life, all the people that had helped me, my friends, my significant other. I was just ungrateful, and by being ungrateful, what I created was a serious lack of connection with any kind of God, higher power, and I was running the show, and I ran it straight into the ground. So right when I relapsed, or before I relapsed, a buddy of mine was talking to me. He's like, you're a great fit for Rock to Recovery with your musical history. And, we're just getting San Diego up and running off the ground. There's a huge buzz around what we're doing. So I'm going to bring you in on this. And I was like, yeah, okay, sounds cool, whatever.
Right.
And then I went out and I relapsed. And while I was out there relapsed, I went out for about 4 months. And this friend of mine was trying to help me come back in. And he was, his name's Brandon Parkhurst, and he's the guy that does he's the San Diego manager for Rock to Recovery. Great guy. he was putting me up on his couch as I'm lying to him and shooting dope in his bathroom, and he was trying to help me. And what ended up happening is I literally lost my mind. I was mixing amphetamines with the heroin, and I ended up, a couple guys that owned a recovery home were trying to help me out, and they'd call me. And one night I just went completely insane. And I ended up at their house. They gave me an option. They said, we'll help you, but we want you to make a 90-day commitment, and we need your car keys and your cell phone and your wallet. And I agreed, and I stayed at this recovery home. I didn't sleep for 2.5 weeks. I did not have the luxury or curse, I'm not quite sure what it is yet, of a posh detox with a lot of great medications and a nursing staff. I had a pleather couch, which I sweated into for 2.5 weeks without a wink of sleep, and was suicidal. And I knew that there was firearms in this house, and there's a part of my story I like to share. It's powerful for me. And I noticed that when I share it, people feel into it. And so I had taught my mother how to text 4 months prior. It would be like, as an example, it'd be like day number 4, and it'd be like 3:30 a.m. And I would be moving off of the couch, coming out of the fetal position to walk down to the basement to grab a gun out of the gun cabinet and shoot myself. And my phone would ring, and it was my mother from 1,200 miles away. And she would gently say into the phone, "You just woke me up. Stop it."
Wow.
And that happened. It'd be a miracle if it happened one time, and it was a miracle.
Sure.
But that happened several times during that 2.5 week process without any sleep. So that is where, and my mom's a very religious, spiritual woman. And the reason I say religious, and I don't mean that can have a bad connotation, but religious means basically to just practice something repetitively. And that's what she does. So her connection to God is the reason I believe that I'm still on this planet and have always been on this planet.
And thank God you're talking to us now. And to get this straight, I mean, this is amazing because, you're detoxing, you're in pain, and your mom, you're ready to go end your life. And your mom calls you and texts you from hundreds of miles away, and she stops you from doing that. And that's a miracle numerous times.
Yeah. And then I just stayed. I hear it a lot in meetings, 12-step meetings, just stay. And I stayed 1 month, and then I reevaluated, and I'm like, I didn't want to stay. Yet a month I was so angry and so lost and so brokenhearted from all of my own wreckage. I wanted to leave, and I stayed 2 months, and then I stayed another month. And when I got to that 90-day commitment part, I was like, I'm not ready to go anywhere. I knew that I had started working some like little odd jobs for friends of mine, and I felt productive again in society. And then I ended up staying for 4 months, and at 4 months I reevaluated again. And I was like, I'm in no hurry. My life's on a good track. I started doing yoga, hot yoga, and that was cleaning my body out and calming my mind. I kept going. I was going to meetings every day. I had a sponsor that was picking me up, taking me to meetings at least 5 times a week. And he also is the one that got me into the hot yoga, which is a big part of the reason why I got the first 2 hours sleep after being up for 2.5 weeks, was that hot yoga. It really helped sweat the stuff out of my system and calm my mind down. And then at 5 months, I reevaluated, and I said, I'm not quite ready to go yet. I still had an apartment that I had been grandfathered into because I knew the owner of the building. So I had a good deal waiting for me. My buddy was subletting it from me. And right at the 6-month mark, I called my buddy and I said, I'm ready to come back home. And I remember I went to my apartment and I cleaned it all out and I painted the walls and I got new furniture to get rid of the memories of all the things that I'd lost with the fiance and the dogs and all the things that I had lost and due to my using. And I remember sitting in my living room after my apartment was all repainted and new furniture. And I sat there and I was alone. And I remember thinking to myself, what was my hurry? Like, okay, here I am now, ready to rejoin society. But what was my hurry? And the one thing I try to get across to my clients, because I work in a lot of places where people are real short-term duration to come into treatment, and they'll be in there for a week or 3 days or 2 weeks or a month.
Right.
And it seems like everyone's got this huge push and this huge hurry to go, they have all these reasons like, well, I got a kid. Well, I got a significant other. Well, I got a job. Well, I got to get back into school. And I'll hear this and I see their hurry to leave, even though their work has allowed them time off.
Exactly.
Their insurance is covering the cost of it. And I just share my story with them. I'm like, I didn't hurry. And I felt like hurrying up until I had like 2 months. I wanted to leave every day. And then after that, I started getting a little bit of sanity about me. And I'll try to express to them, I see it all the time. And what happens a lot of times is these people will be, at a week clean off of drugs or alcohol. They'll be clean for a week. And they'll be like, I got to get back to my kid. And then a month and a half later, I'll see them across town in another treatment center.
Right.
And I'll be like, oh, so obviously they're not there for their kid. That was their main reason for hurrying out of detox or residential treatment.
And the initial part of sobriety too, and I know this from personal experience, you want to get back to things. You want to apologize to the people you hurt. You want to rebuild your life. You want to get back to your family. You want to say, I'm sorry for this and it'll never happen again. I know working in the field myself, being in recovery, and I heard this from somebody else that I respect very much that I work with. And she always says, you will lose whatever you put in front of your sobriety of your recovery. And I've seen it happen time and time again. They don't put their sobriety or recovery program first. They put their job and their family. And I'll tell you what, those things go away if they don't do self-care and work on their own personal program of recovery.
Absolutely. They'll be the first things that go. As soon as a person picks up a drug or a drink, those typically, almost all the time, those are the very first things to go is the family, the job, all the things, all the excuses that they left early for.
The cars, the houses, the wife, the friends. Yeah,
and it brings it back to that whole first detox that I went to, where I'm in there and I feel like I'm caged up. And, now I know how to pair my shoes up next to the door so they look orderly and make my bed. And
right.
I think I'm ready to go out and rejoin society, but I have no clue that I'm absolutely insane.
Yes.
What ended up happening was the Rock to Recovery came back into play. My friend Brandon, who was with me the whole way, once I had about 6 months sober, he brought up the idea again. And he said, if you have a year sober, you could join us in what we're doing and you'd be great at it. And so when I got to about 10 months sober, he was like, at the time, I actually was doing really well. And it was a job that was cool for me. I was caretaking for somebody with a traumatic brain injury. This really nice guy, really intelligent, but had no memory. He would forget somebody's name 10 seconds later or forget them, period. But I felt like I was doing a job that had some purpose to it. And I didn't know, but at the time, I didn't know this, but what it was God putting me in a position where I was caring for somebody else and learning how to grow, how to expand my patience with people.
Right.
because I think in early recovery, a lot of times we suffer from lack of patience. And so I ended up at about 10 months, I started going around with Brandon and watching him do these rock to recovery sessions. And it was really hard to sit in the groups and not want to participate, because it was right up my alley. I mean, we're in a group of guys or gals and we're creating a song. And I found that I could help in all aspects. Watching him run these sessions, I could help with the lyric writing, I could help with the piano part, I could help with the guitar part. So I just chipped in.
Yeah.
And sat and watched the process, and I watched how excited people got that were non-musicians, that were picking up an instrument for the first time, being shown a little part to play, and then being recorded, and then watching their faces light up as they were listening to the playback of this song that they had just created. I mean, they were actually bona fide recording artists on SoundCloud.
And it's amazing. And that's what brings us to this right here, me talking to you. And, you know, I know a couple of years ago, I reached out before I even met you, and definitely a lot before I met Brandon, but I reached out and I knew that I wanted to do something where I'm connecting with positive people. And Rock to Recovery was right where I was like, this is a great concept. They're going around to treatment facilities. They have this band. I know it started like in 2012, the year that I got sober. I'm like, what a great concept. And I reached out to Brandon, and he talked to us. Yeah, we'll get together and talk about this. And then I got a job at True North, and Wednesday night she'd come over, and here's Christian and setting up the band and setting up the guitars. And it's like a little rock recording studio in our treatment facility. Right off the bat, you know, I loved you. I'm like, told you a little bit my story, and you set it up, and I did see positive change in people. They love it. And you get recorded on SoundCloud, and you're your own rock star, you know, for one song. And you know what? I'm telling you what, just the process of getting the group together and writing the lyrics to a song and putting it out there, it makes the person feel important, that they're a part of something bigger than themselves. And they can do these things, and they can get through this recovery process. And it's a great program. I can't say enough good things about Rock to Recovery, you know, and it was amazing that I didn't meet Brandon until last Saturday, actually, in person. But it's an amazing story, and it's an amazing process, and the synchronicities that are in my life and that what you've experienced in sobriety, it's just, you can't even explain it. You have to live it. And it's a wonderful life.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And I've grown so much doing this job. I've grown so much, you know, and it is a job, because at times you get people in your groups that are like, oh, you know, you get people that are super sick and they're suffering.
Right.
But once the music comes on, I experienced a session last night. This lady was, you know, not even a day sober, and she was so bitter. And then by the time the music came on, she was literally dancing in the middle of the room. And so we get to see that kind of magic. Yeah, I remember having you in groups at True North, and it was really cool to have you come in and sit on guitar, and I could see your love for music. It was awesome. And there was one cool story I'd like to share about True North, and obviously don't mention names, but there was a client in there that was a classical piano player. By the age of 12, he had a room full of awards for his abilities, and he was gay, and his father ended up really being abusive with him, really strict and abusive, then left his mother, and this particular person blamed himself for his father leaving. And actually, from what he told me, the fact that he came out as a gay male was part of the reason that his father did leave, if not the reason. And so it was major trauma for this guy. And he was in one of my sessions many times, and he wouldn't play anything. But one day he sat down at the piano and he started playing, and then he became our regular piano player for the couple months that he was there at True North. And the cool thing was that one day he caught me in the parking lot after, like as he's ready to graduate the program, and he goes, I just want to share with you that I didn't play piano since I was 12 years old. And he goes, when being in your group, he goes, not only did I enjoy playing with you guys, he goes, but you re-inspired me. I went out and I bought a baby grand piano.
That's so awesome. That is great. And what a feeling to be a part of that too, right? You know, you changed this person's life. You made a positive impression on him, and who knows what he's doing now. It'd be nice to have him reach back out, and maybe he can talk to us and be on the show.
That would be great. That would be great. So today, what Rock to Recovery is definitely a great musical release, and we help people with PTSD, substance abuse issues, primarily substance abuse, but we also work with the Wounded Warriors, like I said, and it's a great vehicle to help people recover. And today I'm taking everything a step in the healing direction a little bit further. I'm involved. I've been helping throw a festival for the last 2 years, and it's called ArtPad, and it's spelled ARTE/PAD, and it's the Healing Arts Festival. So we're mixing the modalities of music and sound bowl therapy and yoga and acupuncture and Reiki and all of these different modalities of healing. And we're having these festivals where all these different healers, artists, and vendors come and bring all of their magic together, basically just creating community so that people can meet other people that are in the healing arts, healing arts community.
That is so powerful. How do people get a hold of you? Do you have a website for that or phone number? Or?
If you go to ArtPad, ARTE/PAD, there's a Facebook and there's a website for it. And we're actually having a party on the 25th of this month. And it's going to have some spoken word. It's going to have some little people we're asking people to collectively come bring their arts. And we're having a DJ, and we're having a live yoga class by this gal. She's amazing. Her name's Amy. She's up in the North County area.
Okay.
And she teaches 12-step yoga, actually. And
nice.
Yeah, so she's going to be running a yoga class, and we're going to have acupuncture in this side room, and because it requires like a calm, peaceful environment. Right. And yeah, we're going to have several different healing modalities there, and dance and musical expression. So
that's the 25th of this month, October.
Yep, it's the 25th of this month, and you can look on. It'll be on it's all over Facebook. There's a lot of invites, so anyone is welcome to come to that. That likes healing.
Right.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
That is so great. And you're planning right now. So you're planning right now for next year's event, the big event you have.
The big event next year. So,
God, yeah. Christian, it's so awesome listening to you and talking to you. I mean, I could talk to you or let you share your story for hours. I mean, you have to come back on because your story of what happened and what you went through and your struggles and your sobriety path right now and what you're doing with, working in treatment facilities, Rock to Recovery, and your festival is coming up. I think it's such a great, great movement, and you're helping a lot of people for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. When I heard your story, I was like, so I hear a lot. We all hear a lot of stories. Right. But when you hear about a narcotics detective that was doing heroin, right, you're like the stories don't get much better than that.
Oh yeah, it's great to live it too, right? Dude, it was a crazy it was the living hell for sure. But making it through it and finding recovery and working a program, and finally for the first time in my life is being honest and trusting my heart first without worrying about other people trusting me, and being honest to me because I couldn't be honest to myself. And it went down the darkest rabbit hole I could even imagine. And I knew that at the very bottom, consequences for me were like losing everything. but I knew people that were in recovery, they gave me hope that I believed maybe 15% that what they were telling me was true at the time. Because for me, a lot like you, I didn't hear about, I knew about it. I knew about recovery. I knew about, 12-step programs. To me, it was a whole different thing. There was some kind of cult that I didn't want to be a part of. But yeah, it's amazing living through it and getting to where I'm at right now and reaching out to all the positive, connections like you throughout the world eventually, where we can all form, a common union, and everybody has their own facets in what they do and what their expertise or passion is in recovery. And whether it's PTSD, depression, anxiety, drug addiction, alcoholism, sex addiction, whatever it is. But if we can all find a common ground and break the stigma that's surrounding us that keeps so many people suffering in silence, I think this world is going to be a better place because of people like you and the people that we hang around with that are on the same path.
I love it. And I love the work you're doing with the first responders as well. I read a book one time that said if you're an alcoholic and you find recovery, then the best way you're going to be of service in life is to help other alcoholics. That's
what they say, and that is true.
Couldn't agree more. Love it.
You're doing great work, Christian. And let everybody know again exactly what your website is and what the name of it is so they can look it up.
Yeah, it's ARTPAD, ARTE/PAD. And we are throwing the biggest healing arts festival in California. And it's going to be next September. And we are having a planning party / healing arts party on the 25th of this month. And you can find the details at ArtPad on Facebook or our website. And it's going to be a mix of all kinds of cool stuff, improv, spoken word, karaoke style, yoga, acupuncture, and it's going to be awesome.
It sounds like a lot of fun and everybody's going to enjoy it. And God, man, thank you so much. And everybody listening, have a great rest of your day. And Christian, you take care, and I hope to see you real soon, buddy.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Positive Connections Radio, in affiliation with Mental Health News Radio. Have a great rest of your day, and until next time, be strong, stand up, speak your truth, and break the stigma.